whatever. Okay.
Hello, my name is Archer Vick, and today is Wednesday, March 24th, 2004, and we're here at the Atlanta History Center. Sir, would you tell me your name?
Okay. It's Richard D. The middle name is DeLoss McFarland, M-C-F-A-R-L-A-N-D.
And where were you born?
I was born in Akron, Ohio in 1921.
Okay. And can you tell me your branch of service?
U.S. Army.
And your battalion?
During World War II, I was with the 3rd Battalion of the 349th Infantry Regiment, a part of the 88th Division.
Where did you grow up mostly? I know that you were born in Akron.
Yeah, I grew up in Akron, Ohio. I went through school there from grade 1 through grade 12. I graduated from high school in 1940, and my wife, Grace, graduated from the same high school in 1939, 1 year ahead of me. We've known one another since we were in the 4th grade together. And we graduated then. I started at the University of Akron in what was called the cooperative system of education, where you go to school one semester and you work one semester, because this was in 1940 and things were pretty slim. The Depression had just stopped, if you will. But I started at the University of Akron.
And how old were you?
Well, in 1940, I would have been 19 years old. 19, yeah. When World War II broke out at Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, I was a student at that time and part-time work, as you well know.
What work did you do?
Well, the work that I did, and if you recall, you probably are not familiar with Akron, it's a rubber city.
Okay.
Goodyear, Firestone, General Tire, Goodrich, all those companies were centered and did their manufacturing in Akron, Ohio. So if you went to school in Akron University, you could get a degree in chemical engineering, which related to synthetic products, you know. I didn't want that. So I went in as a liberal arts student initially in 1941, I guess, right after, well, no, it was 1940, that's right. And when war broke out, I came from a family of 3 children, my older brother, my older sister, and myself, and my dad and mom. I told Robert, who was my brother, I said, I want to enlist. And he says, no, you will not enlist, because our father had already died when I was a sophomore in high school, and my mom was by herself except for the children.
And what did he die of?
Heart attack.
Okay.
He died of a heart attack.
Fairly young.
Oh, yeah, he was about 52 years old
So
at that
he
time.
left family, with your mother only keeping 4 children? Or
3 children. 3 children, exactly. By this time, my brother and my sister had already graduated from high school, and Robert was attending the University of Akron.
How was your mom?
She would, well, it was pretty rough, because if you recall, during the 1930s, that was the height of the Depression.
Right.
I mean, it was pretty rough, even though you had an income. My mom didn't work. She was a housewife all of her life.
Where did your income come from?
Well, it came from my dad most of the time until he passed away. And then because of the regulations, the insurance and stuff, and by this time Robert was working. So we had a little bit of an income coming in, and I was working part-time. And my sister had already gotten married, and she had moved with her husband to another location.
So you had to grow up pretty fast.
It was, yeah, and when you tie that in with the world events happening in 1941, things happened pretty gosh darn fast.
When you think back on those times, do you think back on those times as a very hard time, or were they enjoyable times?
They were enjoyable times, but we went, Grace and I, my wife, we went to the same grade school and high school, and we knew all the kids. We were in a neighborhood, you know, and So the relationship between the community and all that was very close. And everybody was in the same circumstance. There wasn't any money.
Right.
I recall as a youngster, there were men, let's say in 30s and 40s, who would come to the back door of our house and knock on the door and ask for work or food because they were broke. They just didn't have any job. And these men, not any women, I don't recall any women appearing at our back door. But my mom would always say, well, come on in and have something to eat, and if you can do some work for us out in the yard or something, okay.
Can you move your hand off?
Oh, yeah. So, I'm sorry. So they did, and these people were very proud,
Right.
very proud, and you can understand why. So throughout that period of time, we got along, but you didn't have a lot of extraneous matter. You just didn't go to shows. You didn't go to things like that. We had picnics, which were good, but they were just like, what do you call them, potluck
Right.
dinners or something?
Well, you had told me, so you're in college at this point, or in
Yeah.
school.
Yes.
And you decided to take a liberal arts
Right.
a path as far as your education.
Right.
And I think you had mentioned about that time Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Right.
Do you remember where you were?
Yes, I was on a date. I was on a date with my wife, bowling, of all things, and it was a Sunday afternoon.
Uh-huh.
By this time, there were, between Akron and Hawaii, there's about 6.5, I believe, hours difference. Anyhow, the word came out that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, and
How did you first hear it? Did somebody say something?
on the radio.
So you could hear it while you were bowling?
Oh, sure. And people looked at one another, and I've got to say that the name Pearl Harbor didn't ring a bell at all.
Wow.
Because even though we'd had geography and history and everything, you don't know.
You didn't know the naval base was there.
No. So from that time, then I think it was Monday, the following Monday, that President Roosevelt appeared at the joint session of Congress and announced the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the day of infamy. You remember that?
So that day when you first heard about it,
Yeah.
you just kind of kept on about your
We did.
business because it really didn't register, is that
No.
right?
It registered that there was a disaster, that because the announcers, and don't ask me who they were, I don't know, but they went in to explain that the Pacific Fleet was just destroyed. And later on, we saw pictures of it.
Right.
Newsreel in the movie house, but and we didn't have television. There was no television, so that's the way it started.
So at that point in time, you're in college.
Yeah.
Where does the military come in?
Well, as I said, I tried, and I think I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of youngsters who had graduated from high school that were starting in their college work. They didn't know what they wanted to do, what degree they wanted to get. And then to have something like this happen, everything changed just overnight.
Okay.
Patriotism reared its head like you can't believe. Everybody is parading around calling Japs pretty bad names and wanting to retaliate. And that's the first thing that came to my mind. And I told Robert and my mom.
And Robert is your brother?
Yes.
Okay.
That I wanted to enlist, and he says, no, you have to help contribute to the care of my mom. And I, meaning my brother, already had a draft number. So did I. But it hadn't come up. It hadn't been pulled, you follow me? So he said, you just keep on doing what you're doing, because I don't know if you'll go first or I'll go first or what, because the draft was on.
Sure.
Okay? As it turned out, my number came up in May of 42. Up to that time, I had never really, thought of a military career, not a bit. So I was called down to the draft board, and they said, well, you're going to go into the Army.
Did you get your draft notice via mail?
Yes, you get a letter that says greetings.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Was it a postcard?
No, it was a form letter from Uncle Sam. Selective service, I think. It said, greetings, you are hereby notified, something to the effect that you are inducted. I don't think it said the words for the duration. It could have, for X number of months or years in the United States Army. And you will report within, let's say, 2 weeks to Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, which is down by Columbus, Ohio, right outside. In fact, it was in the city limits, just like Fort McPherson is in the city limits here.
And that's a base, is that?
Oh, it's not a base, it's a post. The Army calls them posts or camps,
Okay.
and the Navy and Marine call them bases, and the Air Force too.
Okay.
So, terminology, I was told to report to Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, by, I think it was May or June of 1942, yeah.
At that time, when you received that notice, you had said you were interested in joining before. Were you elated or were you excited?
Well, I was excited. I think everybody, because I had a lot of buddies that I played ball with in different sports, and we were all about the same age. This is 18 and 19 years of age, and you knew that you were subject to draft. Right. You knew you were, and a lot of them decided, well, I'm not going to wait for the draft, I'm going to enlist. Right. Well, you can enlist at that time for 3 years in the Army,
okay,
for a hitch in the Army. But I was drafted, and I went to Fort Hays. I left Grace. I wasn't married at the time. She came down to the railroad station in Akron, Ohio, and my mom was there. My brother was there, because he hadn't been drafted yet. And I went off in civilian clothes, and I went down to Fort Hays.
Did you take any clothes with you?
Oh, yeah, just a handbag.
What did they tell you to take?
Shaving kit, a toothpaste, toothbrush, hairbrush, a change of underwear. A change of underwear. And that's about it.
Wow.
Because once you got there, I had already, as the other draftees, been sworn in.
Oh,
that's done at the draft board. Yeah, that's done at the draft board. You are sworn in as a private in the Army, and we made $21 a month. That was a pay scale. And I went down to Fort Hays then and was inducted formally, and I went through the line at the quartermaster warehouse, and they give you uniforms, and they give you shoes and boots and everything, and you form up into a company, and you're in the Army. And it's an eye-opener, because none of us had ever been in the military before.
At this point, during basic training, I believe, is 3 weeks.
Oh gosh, no, it was 8 weeks.
8 weeks.
Yeah, but this is not basic training. This is induction. Induction. For basic training, you have to take a series of tests when you first go in. And those tests determine for the Army what branch of service you're going into. Well, I made a pretty high score, and it's like an IQ test. And I was assigned to go to basic training in the Signal Corps to learn to be a signalman, okay? Once that was published, and a few of the buddies that I went with were sent from Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, to Camp Crowder, Missouri, which is in the city, right outside the city of Joplin, and that was a Signal Corps basic training camp. And we learned how to splice wire, how to operate radios, how to do the Morse code, all that kind of stuff.
Did you enjoy the
Oh, absolutely. Everybody did, sure. Because you were all, misery loves company, I guess. But we did, and you complete basic training, you learned to be a soldier, how to stand tall, how to do right face, left face, about face, all that basic things, how to march and carry your rifle and to shoot it and how to shoot pistols and machine guns.
Did you enjoy shooting weapons
I didn't enjoy, well, I did, I guess.
at that time?
Yeah, I had never gone much into hunting because growing up in the city, we didn't do much hunting. We really didn't. Grace's brothers, my wife, ultimately, oh yes, she and her brothers had gone hunting and fishing and everything. But in basic training, you learn how to become a real soldier. And
During the basic training time, can you think back from that point in time where you went into the military, during your basic training, were there any bad experiences that you had that kind of stick out in your mind?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. Not so much at basic training, but a little bit later, and I'll explain that. You now are associated with soldiers from all over the country. And my buddy, who I became very close to, was from...
What's his name?
His name is Floyd Lingenfelter. Floyd,
You're the same age as you?
about, just
Where's
about.
he from?
From Claremore, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And when we first met, I had never met anybody from Oklahoma, let alone outside of Ohio or Akron. But Floyd says, well, I'm from Claremore, Oklahoma. Are you familiar with Claremore, Oklahoma? I said, absolutely not. I said, what is it famous for? He says, it's the home of Will Rogers. I said, well, now that name rings a bell because he was very popular, And he says, that's where I grew up and where I graduated. So you become very, very close to soldiers, buddies. That's the term that you use. And it worked out very fine because he and I went through the entire basic training together. And then after basic training, the Army has what is called AIT, Advanced Infantry Training. Advanced individual training, some people put it, because they didn't want to go in the infantry, okay? My assignment when I finished that basic training was to a radio school to learn operation of radio, Morse code, and all that stuff in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, now we're back east. We're close to Akron, Ohio. We're only 3 or 4 hours away from Akron. And when I got there, Floyd Lingenfelter went with me on the train. You traveled always by train in uniform. And we got to Pittsburgh, and there were probably about 60 soldiers, all privates, that started into the radio school. It was called Keystone Radio School at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It occupied a former Pontiac garage. The military, by this time now, it's 1942, had taken over a lot of buildings, a lot of facilities. And the radio school, the orderly room, in other words, the headquarters for the school, was on the ground floor. And then the ramp where the cars used to go up to get serviced, to be oil changed, that thing, was the barracks. And Floyd Lingenfelter and I were assigned there, and he had the upper bunk and I had the lower bunk. And that's where we went through radio school.
But what in basic training, what was a bad experience that you had?
The bad experience there was watching a man throw a hand grenade, and you had to learn how to throw a hand grenade. And it exploded. He wasn't killed, but he got injured because he didn't throw it far enough. One of the things that they tell you very early on, when you take the pin out of a hand grenade, it's armed, it's ready to go. And as long as you keep your hand on the hand grenade with the flange against your hand. When you throw it, because you pulled the pin, the flange comes off, and now it's armed. And there's about 4.5 seconds before it explodes. Well, they teach you to duck down behind the sandbags. He didn't quite get down before it exploded, and he got injured pretty bad. And that's the one thing that really stands out. And that happens time and time again.
So you're in radio school, and
Right.
it's 1942.
Right.
And I guess the war has progressed.
Yes.
What happens after radio school?
Okay. One thing that is interesting, being in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a very beautiful metropolitan city, here are soldiers in uniform in town. When you go outside, you're a sort of a strange breed of cat. But these same folks that look at you have sons or husbands or daughters or uncles that are in the same condition you are. So I remember vividly that on Sunday mornings, usually, there would be lines of cars that would come up in front of the Pontiac garage to pick up the GIs to take them to dinner. They wanted to show their patriotism. They wanted to talk because their son was now maybe over in the Pacific someplace. So that was beautiful. You really appreciate your fellow citizens. And the patriotism was 100%. Oh, you had conscientious objectors, I'm sure. I didn't know any. But the people that came there wanted to show their respect and to take care of you. When we graduated, I was assigned, I had been promoted to corporal, and I was assigned to the 13th Armored Division in Camp Beale, California, which is way up by Marysville, California. That's way across country.
Do you remember how you got there?
Sure, by train. Everybody moved by train. But the thing that I remember about graduation in Pittsburgh, my mother, my future wife, and my brother, who hadn't been inducted yet, came to Pittsburgh. We're only, 120, 130 miles away from Akron. And they saw me graduate there, and I have pictures that are family pictures that were taken there. When I got ready to leave Pittsburgh, you get on a troop train because it's just loaded with soldiers. There are civilians trying to get on board, but they come second.
Right.
The military is first. So we went all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, through Chicago, out west, got to Sacramento, and from Sacramento, Camp Beale, California is, I suppose, about 40 miles, 50 miles outside of the city. Camp Beale at that time was just being built with Army barracks and all that. It was messy, it was muddy and everything. It later became, after World War II, Beale Air Force Base. It's still there today. Beale Air Force Base, very active. So I was assigned to the 13th Armored Division, which rumors start flying among GIs, and the word or the term GI means government issue. So you're a government issue soldier. But we all did our job, and we had learned how to operate a fixed station radio, Morse code and all that, and voice radio too.
So what do you think about being an armor?
Well, that was one thing that I had never been before, obviously.
Exciting, or?
Oh, it was exciting because you didn't know what your ultimate assignment was going to be. So I did as I was told, and ultimately, along about, it was 1943 by this time, the company commander of the company that I was with, training to be in the Armored Division, called me in one day and said, "You are to appear before a board of officers for possible officer candidate school training."
Do you remember the name of that gentleman?
No.
Okay.
No. I know he was a Signal Corps. Signal Corps wore 2 semaphore flags on their collar.
What, to that news, what?
Well, I had expressed the thought that I'd like to become a commissioned officer, and I wasn't aware of what it would take. But anyhow, he called me in and he said, "Well, you will appear because of your scores." Again, going back to induction. You will appear before a board of officers, and you will either pass or fail, as the case may be, because there are other soldiers coming in too. So you dress up in your finest uniform and you report, and sitting on the board at that time were 3 full colonels. And I had never been that close to a full colonel in my life, and it scares the hell out of you. But 2 of them, one was an infantry officer, one was an armored officer. We were at an armored center, and one was a Signal Corps officer. So they question you and they try to put you at ease, but you're under tension. But anyhow, I remember the Signal Corps officer asking me, "Well, why do you think you would be a good Signal Corps officer?" And I said, "Well, sir, I've taken basic training. I know Morse code. I know how to operate a radio. I know how to do this and that." And he sort of snickered a little bit, and he said, "Well, there's more to being in the Signal Corps than just that. I think," and he's expressing his opinion, "I think you'd make a good infantry officer." Well, the infantryman and the armored officer, they pricked up their head. That's a good idea. Ultimately, they recommended that I be transferred from Camp Beale, California, to school at Fort Benning, Georgia, to go to Officer Candidate School, OCS.
When he said that, what went through your mind? What was the first thing on your mind when you said that?
Well, I thought to myself, well, I'll get to be an officer, and I'll be in the infantry. That's a good branch of service. You're very proud, and you'd heard about the infantry, the Marines, and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So you were excited.
Oh, absolutely.
Great.
So I got on a train in Camp Beale, and by this time, my sister had married a couple years before that, and had moved with her husband to Phoenix, Arizona, because Phoenix had a Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company plant there, and it was association with that. He wasn't in the military yet. He ultimately was, but not then.
So what year was this that you...
It would have been 1943, because I arrived, when I left Camp Beale, it was just after Christmas 1943, because I remember going with my buddy to a show in Marysville, California, and seeing Bing Crosby in the movie, what's the movie I'm trying to think of? That has such a beautiful song associated with it.
I'm not sure.
I'll remember it. But we went there, we saw that movie, we came back, and I lost track of Floyd at that time. He was assigned someplace else, and I went back to Fort Benning. But on the way, I purposely knew that my sister, and by this time my mom, was in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. Well, what had happened when Robert, my brother, was drafted, my mom had to, she was by herself. Her sister, her daughter had already left, I had left, and Robert left. So Maria, my sister, said, "Well, why don't you come out to Phoenix and live with us, because you can't take care of yourself." So she did. At that time, keep in mind now that travel was very difficult. And my mom rode a Greyhound bus from Akron, Ohio to Phoenix, Arizona. By the time she got to Phoenix, she couldn't even get off the bus. She was just too exhausted, too distraught. And she died in Phoenix in January of 1943, just after I
Reached Fort Benning.
yeah. Well, I saw her in the hospital, and that's the last time I saw her.
What'd she die of?
She just died, I suspect, of stress and overexertion. There wasn't any kind of a heart attack, but she was completely exhausted because of the long trip, because of the uncertainty. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't have a husband. She didn't have a family anymore. They were all gone. And it got to her.
How old approximately was she?
About 53.
Can
So-
you tell me, so we're at Fort Benning at,
Well, when I left there, then I went to Fort Benning. And that's where I found out that she had died. When I reported to Fort Benning, I was now a staff sergeant, because all of the candidates, officer candidates, were immediately promoted to what we call E5, staff sergeant, because of the pay. And you were a candidate, but you weren't called sergeant. You were called candidate. So when I arrived at Fort Benning after a long trip across country, I was called into the company commander's office, and the first sergeant said, "The company commander wants to see you." And I reported to him, and he said, "Well, we have word through the Red Cross that your mom has died in Phoenix, and we are prepared to give you an emergency leave because your brother, who is now in the Army Air Corps in Colorado, had gotten in touch with the Red Cross to have the body transported from Phoenix to Akron, Ohio for ultimate burial. And you are hereby given the opportunity to take a 30-day leave. You won't start school yet." So I said, "Well, I don't have any money. I just don't have any money to buy a train ticket all the way." And they said, "Don't you worry about that. The Red Cross will give you your tickets, both going and coming." And they did. So we went there. We buried our mom in a little town of Freeport, Ohio, which is down very close to Columbus, Ohio. And her husband was there, so they're now together, okay? That was the only time in my military career that I saw my brother and I in uniform. So he had come back, and he was now in the Army Air Corps long before the Air Force.
What was his rank?
He was a private or PFC or something. Our sister was not able to come back from Phoenix. There just wasn't enough money. So then I left Akron and went back to Fort Benning and started OCS, which is 90-day wonder. That's what they called us, 90-day wonder. And I graduated as a second lieutenant infantry in May of 1943.
Okay, and what was your next step after that?
Everybody is lined up, and they have the orders from the War Department. That's what it was known as at that time. Now, all these second lieutenants, brand new infantry, and they needed them. They were sent all across the country. I was assigned to a post called Camp Fannin, Texas, which is right outside the city of Tyler, 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 Texas. It's in eastern Texas. I'd never been to Texas. I'd heard a lot about it. And anyhow, before I left home, I asked Grace to marry me. And she thought about that for a while. And finally she said, "Excuse me." She said, I'll have to go back, Archer, I'm sorry. When I came home for my mom's funeral, after the funeral, and I still had a few days leave left, I asked Grace to marry me, and she said, "Well, let's think about it." And during my OCS days, I kept writing, and she finally said yes. And I said, "Well, wait until I'm a second lieutenant, an officer. and then we'll get married. So I got second lieutenant's commission. I went to Camp Fannin, Texas, and I called back and I said, well, will you come to Tyler, Texas, which is the railroad station, and we'll get married there? And she said yes. And her escapade on the train was just like my mom's. You sit on your luggage because there's soldiers all over the place and they have priority. So she came. We got married in June 19th, 1943 in Tyler, Texas.
At what point did you go across seas?
Okay. After we got married, and I was working there as a second lieutenant in a training center were all recruits, you know. The word came out that about 3 or 4 of us were going to be transferred to Camp Polk, Louisiana. Most of the places in the Army at that time were known as camps, not forts. They've ultimately become forts. Camp Polk, Louisiana was where the maneuvers were being held. And I knew that we couldn't stay together, my wife and I, very long, but we traveled from Camp Fannin, Tyler, to Fort Polk. When we got there, they said, well, your regiment that you're going to join is with the 88th Division, and they're at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, the 349th Infantry. And you are to report to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, within 10 days or so. So Grace and I went to Fort Sam, which is in San Antonio. We established a little home there in an apartment. I was making, at that time as a second lieutenant, $120 a month, which was unbelievable. And
at that time, unbelievable meaning great.
Oh, absolutely great. Oh, yeah, I'd never seen that much money in my life, and neither had anybody else. Anyhow, we lived there, and she went to work. She went to work for the YMCA. No, not the YWCA there in San Antonio. We only stayed in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, there for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and then the division, by this time off of maneuvers, was ordered to go to overseas.
Where were you ordered to go to?
You didn't know. You didn't know. All you were told that your unit that I had joined was Headquarters Company's 3rd Battalion, 349th Infantry, was to board a train, and that train was going to Newport News, Virginia, which is right outside of Norfolk. And there you were going to get on a boat and go someplace. You had no idea where.
So did you like the transatlantic?
No. I got sick as a dog. I'd never been on the ocean before, and I'd say 80% of my fellow soldiers and officers were in the same kit and caboodle. But I was a little bit privileged because I was a commissioned officer, you see, and the soldiers were way down in the hold, and it wasn't bad. It took us on the Empress of Scotland. It was a former private passenger line out of Scotland. It sailed by itself without any protection from destroyers because of its speed. We left Newport News, Virginia. It was sailed for about 8 or 9 days and arrived in Casablanca in Morocco.
Wow. That's pretty fast.
Yeah, we'd never experienced any problem. Anyhow, we got there, the division, you have 3 regiments, 349th, 350th, 351st. You have probably in the entire division about 15,000 soldiers, troops altogether, officers and men. We got to Africa just at the close of the African campaign. If you recall, General Patton had been opposed and fought against Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was quite prominent. The combat in Africa, we didn't see it. Some of our people in the 88th Division saw it as what we call an advanced party. You go out and you learn a little bit about combat and artillery fire and small arms. but I didn't engage in combat there. Ultimately, we moved from North Africa to Oran, Algeria. We got on a Oran is a port city in North Africa, right on the Mediterranean Sea. And we again, this is now.
What year was that?
We're just trying to think. 1943. It would have been again about
43, 44?
44. Excuse me.
Was this during the winter time, or?
Oh yeah, it was. We sailed from Oran to Naples, across the Mediterranean with escort vessels, Navy and other services in other countries, and we landed in Naples, and finally, about May of 1944, April or May of 1944. I went into the line with my unit against the German forces at a place called Minturno.
Please spell that.
Minturno.
Okay.
This little map here, I think, will show you. Let me see if I can find it. I thought there was a map here.
That's okay.
Well, in any event, if you look at the map of Italy, yeah, there it is. There it is. I thought there was something. Okay.
That on the camera?
Yeah, can you see it?
Yes. You want to point
Okay.
to it?
Here's the city of Naples. Right here, going up this Highway 1,
Turn it towards me.
is toward Rome. The book is entitled The Road to Rome. We went in line about right here, just north of the city of Naples.
Sure.
And then from that time on, with the 88th Division and with the unit I was with, we went all the way to the Alps, to the Brenner Pass.
Okay, thank you. I've got it.
Okay.
You can take that.
The interesting thing is we'd never been in combat before, and the German army was very strong, very professional.
When you were there, I guess you were. Can you tell me a little bit about your first combat?
My job in the battalion was the communications officer of the infantry battalion. In a battalion you have 3 rifle companies, and then you have 1 weapons company, 4 companies, and then you have what is called the headquarters company. The headquarters company has the commanding officer, communications, intelligence, and logistics for supply. And it's our job, it was my job as a communications officer to make sure that the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel at that time, was always in communication with his company commanders, regardless of what was happening, whether it was artillery fire, small arms fire, what have you. When I say small arms fire, I mean rifles or machine guns or things like that. So I stayed as a communications officer with the 3rd Battalion all the way from just north of Naples for the next year, about 18 months, 14 months, until the end of the war. And I wasn't injured. I was not injured. I was blown up one time later on after we passed through Rome, up by Florence, Italy. From Florence we went up into the Apennine Mountains, Appenins, something like that, which is the first time we'd been in real mountainous terrain. All the units were fighting in the mountains. And I happened to be assigned one day by the battalion commander to establish radio contact with an outpost, which was, I suppose 150 yards ahead of us, in an old bombed out building. So I took a machine gun crew, 3 guys and myself and 1 radio operator, and we crawled as close as we could get to the building. And unfortunately, by this time I'm a first lieutenant. I had been promoted to first lieutenant. I should have kept my eyes open and looked around a little bit better, because there was a German tank probably about 200 yards from where we were going into this old building. And he was camouflaged. It was a Panzer tank with an 88 millimeter gun on it. And he was camouflaged, as it turned out. And as we were setting up our machine gun and establishing communications with the elements there, the guy who was the tank commander probably saw us through his telescope, and he fired 2 rounds out of his tank. And we're talking about as far as from here to across the street, you know.
Right.
That's what is known as direct fire. Well, when it hit, 3 of us were blown about 50 feet. We were just blown up. 1 man was killed, 1 man was seriously wounded, and I didn't have a scratch. I didn't have a scratch. To this day, I don't know how. But anyhow...
Do you remember the feeling of it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what was it?
Well, the thing that...
By surprise? Or
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, here it comes.
As you're setting up your communications and your machine gun, you're looking all around, because you don't want to expose yourself.
Crouched down?
Oh, probably on the prone position, because they got their steel helmets on, and it's now pretty much winter time, not quite. There's no snow on the ground, at least I don't remember there was. And just as we got ready to establish contact with the battalion commander, I raised my head and I saw the flash. I'll never forget it. I saw the flash of the gun, which is very close, and it travels so fast, the trajectory. You see the flash and it's on you. There's no way that you're going to get out of it. And the building where it was already bombed out, but it exploded, the crew exploded. I don't know what happened to the gun, and we were just thrown. As it turned out, all of us were decorated for that action, but as I say, I was the only one that wasn't injured.
Do you remember the names of the other 2?
No, I really don't. It would be in my book. There's a book that I have at home. It's a hardbound book. It's called The Blue Devils in Italy. I have it at home, but I didn't bring it. We were referred to, and I might point this out to you. You see this patch?
Aren't you lifted up?
This patch right here is a clover leaf, a blue clover leaf,
Right.
88, 1/8 horizontal, 1/8 vertical. And Axis Sally, who was one of the propaganda gals, she said, she gave us the name, the Blue Devils, and that name stuck all the way through.
So that was when you were in combat. Do you remember any other instances, or was?
Oh, there were a lot of instances where you're shooting and you're trying to do your job. We in the communications in the battalion, you have a wire section, a radio section, a message center section. And all these men, all these soldiers are doing their job all the time. And the battalion commander is trying to make sure that he knows what's going on 100 to 150 yards to his front where the rifle companies are located. And you go back and forth. Your people are working. If you think about it, you can't lay too much wire because the artillery fire will just blow it up and break it. So you rely a great deal on the radio, handheld radio or a backpack radio. But we were able, not all the time, we didn't have communication all the time, but we did a lot of the time. But the combat is something that I never experienced hand-to-hand combat. I experienced shooting at soldiers, the enemy, and it's not good. That's about all I can say.
Do you remember taking the first enemy soldier?
Oh, prisoners? Yeah. Or killing them?
Or killing?
Yeah, yes.
Do you want
And
to-
it's, no, I'd rather not, because that, well, you're doing a job. It's either him or you, you know? It's that simple. It's that basic. And if you don't shoot and get him, he's going to get you. And,
When you're that young,
yeah.
you're really not thinking about it. It's probably, do you want to kind of expand on what's going through your mind at that age
That's a good,
combat?
yeah, that's a good point. You were never prepared to take another person's life, let's put it that way. You were trained to fire, and you were trained to shoot, and you always aim for the heart or the head, you know. But ultimately, when it comes down and you look through your sights and you see a human being out there, it's rather stark at that point. But the soldiers, they know that they've got to do it because well, it's either them or us, you know.
Is it really more fear taking over?
Oh yeah, you're always under apprehension. You really are. I think some people can control a little bit of fear better than others. But if anybody tells you they weren't scared, they're just lying.
Right. So, as far as your combat experiences, what's the closest you're ever to the enemy?
Oh gosh, as far as you and I are apart, but we never got to the point, at least I didn't as an individual officer or a soldier, to the use of my bayonet to stab somebody in the heart or in the stomach or something like that. It was always a little bit apart. But the reason we were that close is because we went out to get a prisoner, and we got him. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Well, it was one of those things that you go out at night, you know where the enemy is.
All the time?
Oh, you better know where he is, because he can infiltrate your position just as you can infiltrate his. But you always have outposts, listening posts, if you will, ahead of your main line of resistance. The Army calls it the MLR, the main line of resistance. That's where most of the foxholes are lined up and everybody's pointing their weapons in one direction, mostly.
So in this excursion,
What it happens to every company, every battalion always sends out patrols to find out where the strength of the enemy is, where his heavy weapons are, where his mortars, where his machine guns. And you go out sometimes with the objective of destroying a gun position, or in our case, this one particular time, to capture a prisoner. To get a prisoner and bring him back so that you can find out, number one, what unit you're facing, how strong is it, do they have any tanks, do they have any artillery, all that kind of stuff.
so when you were ordered to do this, were you in charge of this?
Yes, I was the patrol leader, and I had 6 or 7 men, I can't remember.
Did you know how to do this?
Oh, sure. You'd learned how to patrol.
Or did you know how to actually go out and obtain?
Well, what you have to do is you have to infiltrate at dark, and you don't go out in the daylight hours. And you're told, and you tell your soldiers, okay, make sure you got your weapon loaded and that the safety is off, and we're going, you look at a map, we're going here. I think that position that we're going to try to capture is about 50, 60, 70 yards to our front.
So pretty doggone close.
Oh, it's very close. Yeah, things are very close. So you start moving, and you move very quietly, and you crawl to the best of your ability until you get in a position where you can see your soldiers, and you use hand signals. You never talk. You use hand signals. And you get in a position, and this happened to be a machine gun position, and sure enough, there were 3 soldiers in there, and just as we jumped in to get them, 2 of them stood up, and our soldiers just shot him and killed him. The one man wasn't hit, so we drug him out of the hole, and we were able to scamper back to our friendly lines, and we had our prisoner. And he was as scared as we were.
How many were in your party?
Probably 6 or 7 in the patrol.
So how would you say this prisoner is?
He's a young man. He's probably about our age, maybe 18, 19. He's in the German army, probably conscripted, drafted, if you will, scared to death. And but we took him by surprise, and he even didn't get a chance to raise his rifle, or if he stayed down, but that's the way we got him. But these things are so basic. And you learn as you're crawling along now, what was I taught? What was I taught here? And it came to fruition, and we got the prisoner. And you bring him back, and you turn him over to the higher echelon and the intelligence people, and they interrogate him. You don't. Your job is done.
When you're doing this, when you were going to do this, as a soldier, you've been trained, and I imagine you're quite afraid.
Oh, sure you are.
But at the same time, are you kind of excited?
You're excited and confident that you can get the job done. Exactly.
So, and had combat, I mean, is it in a sport? You're trying to do your job, but at the same time trying to do it well.
Yeah.
In combat, is it very similar?
Very similar. You have an opponent.
Right.
I don't care whether he's a football player, a basketball player, or a soldier. The only difference is that opponent has a weapon, and it's a lethal weapon, and he's ready to use it against you at the drop of a hat. So
how is it going against your opponent with, if you're in a sport, you wouldn't lose your life if you made a mistake or he beat you.
That's right.
But in this one, how do you get over that fear?
Well, you really don't, Archer. You don't get over the fear. I think it's always there. People in close combat, and that's what I'm talking about, the infantryman, the tanker who is exposed out here, or the artilleryman for that matter, you've always got apprehension. Is it going to happen? You don't think about it, really. You try to put it in the back of your mind, I can do my job, and I hope I come out all right. But there's always that fear, sure.
When you got this soldier back, you said that these guys were pretty formidable.
Oh, very much so.
What were they dressed like? What were they?
They were in their winter uniforms. I recall they had a helmet that you see pictures of the Nazi soldier. He was a white man. There were no blacks opposing us at that time. And he was a member of a unit. He was a member of a gun crew, you see. He had his clothes on, he had his uniform on, he had his pistol belt, and I don't know, I can't remember if he had a sidearm, a pistol or not, but I know that most gun crews have sidearms when they're firing their main weapon. He was not an officer. He was an enlisted man. There weren't any officers in that foxhole. So you get him, you capture him. He knows that his war is just about over, but you're still under artillery fire and all that kind of stuff. So the apprehension is never gone.
Right.
It's always there.
So let's move ahead a little bit. I noticed that you've been in Italy, North Africa.
Yeah.
Now you're in Germany?
Well, what happens is, as the war progressed in Italy, we went through all the way to the Alps, and this is the book that I brought.
Let me get a picture of that in just a second.
okay, this is a book that,
You can hold it up.
yeah,
All right. What is that, 19 days?
19 days from the Apennine Mountains to the Alps, and that is the map here.
Okay, hold it there.
Okay,
right here.
here's the city of Florence. This is north,
Right.
and this border is between Italy and Switzerland. You see the term Switzerland right there? And you're attacking from about here. This is toward the end of the war. This is now 1945.
Okay.
Okay? And you can see where these arrows are going. You see this line right here, Archer, that where it's four stars or crosses?
Yes.
That is the line between the 5th Army and the British 8th Army. Okay? And we're all going toward the enemy. We finally stopped the war. If I can show you here, where is the Brenner Pass? Bergamo, Como, Lake Como. Right here, I believe, is the Brenner Pass. No, it's not. No, I was wrong. Thank gosh, Brescia. Anyhow, that's where the 5th Army advanced, and the 7th Army from Germany had already come down through Switzerland and Austria, Austria, not Switzerland, and joined up. And that's where the war ended, in May of 1945.
Wow.
From that time on, I came back home. I had enough points. You get points.
Do you want to share a little bit about some of the photographs?
Oh yeah, I can show you those. These cartoons that were drawn.
Or maybe you want to talk
Okay,
about that?
that's a very good point. Let me see if I can find the city here. Okay, just a minute. Brescia, Bergamo, Como.
Okay.
All right.
Show it to me?
Yeah. About right there. You see this line? This is the border between Austria and Switzerland and Italy.
Okay.
Right about right here. You see the town of Bolzano?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that was a major German headquarters. When the war was over, our unit that I was with stopped the war probably about where my finger is, right there, just below the Brenner Pass.
Okay.
And we occupied a city that was named Merano, Merano. And the interesting thing about the town of Merano was every building was painted with a red cross.
Wow.
Because it was a hospital center.
Right.
It had never been bombed, it had never been attacked, and we occupied it, and our job was to now send back to Germany all of the German soldiers that were ambulatory, that could walk or something. And it was an occupation, and that was what we had to do. While there, we got word that there was a couple, these two people here, who was, his name is, I'm sorry.
Straight.
There you go.
Okay.
His name is Jean Luchaire, Luchaire. He was a former Minister of Information and Propaganda for Vichy France, who were allied to Nazi Germany. We got word through intelligence channels that these two people were trying to escape from Italy into Switzerland. So we sent a patrol out, and we found them.
And you were...
I wasn't in that patrol. No, I wasn't in that patrol. When they got these two people, they brought them back to the battalion headquarters. And this is a picture of me with the two people right after they were captured and brought back.
You know, as I look at that photograph, can you tell me a little bit about what day was this?
Well, this would have been probably in May, late May of 1945.
Right.
I don't see a date on here. Wait a minute. Yeah, there's a date on there. Sure there is.
I've got a date, May 14th, 1945.
1945, just after the war.
It looks to me like who took this photograph of it?
Sergeant in the Stars and Stripes, a newspaper.
And they don't appear to be like prisoners.
No, because they're civilians. They're civilians. But you have received word that there is a man and a woman who are very high officials in the French government who collaborated with the Germans, the Nazis. And you were assigned, the company was assigned to go out and get them if they could find them. They did, and they brought them back, and that's when that picture was taken.
It looks like you're communicating with them in
Yeah.
some sorts, are you?
Yes, because they could both speak English.
Oh, really?
They could both speak English.
Do you remember any of the conversation?
No. Well, I knew that we had, my job by this time, I had been, as I said, promoted to first lieutenant, and that's what I'm wearing there.
Right.
But it was my job to tell them that they were going to be sent back to regimental and division headquarters to be interrogated by the American Army.
Interrogation, is that, I would assume, is a bad thing.
Oh, it's questioning. They want to know, well, what did this guy do? What does he know? What is his daughter, as it turned out, know?
She appears in the picture a bit nervous.
Oh, absolutely. She's smoking a cigarette all the time. She can't, neither can he, if you notice there's a picture.
Did they come across as personally nice people?
They came across as people who were very, very glad that now they're in the hands of the Americans.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Because had they stayed with the Germans, they probably would have been executed. They wanted to get away from the German army and go to Switzerland, where they were protected because it was a neutral country.
So, in a sense, when they were apprehended by the United States, they certainly would not get away.
No, they would. Oh no, that's right. They wouldn't put up any opposition.
So in
they
this
were
situation, they're not bound by any type of handcuffs or anything.
No.
And there's no really any threat to you.
No, they're very docile. They know that they're in the hands of the Army. At least they think that nobody is going to harm them. And now I've told them that they're going back to be interrogated by the higher officials. And that's exactly what happened. Now, from that time that those pictures were taken in May, I stayed with the unit, which was the 3rd Battalion, 349, probably for about two months. And if you recall, the war is still on in Japan, or in the Far East. So some of the people, officers and men, knew that they would be sent to the Far East to continue fighting the Japs this time.
Right. And I noticed that you had also been to Japan.
Yes, but that's another story later on. As it turned out, I was ordered from the division to go back to 5th Army headquarters. I became a staff officer at 5th Army headquarters. Mm-hmm. I still was a first lieutenant, infantry, and I worked in 5th Army headquarters until the word came out, you're going home. You're going back to America.
How'd the word come out to?
Oh, it came out by a telegram through the channels, you know. Not just myself, but a few others. So we moved probably individually from Lake Como up very close to the Swiss border and the Austrian border. From there down to the city of Leghorn, where we got on a ship and came back to America. I arrived back home, I guess, about November of 1945. By this time, I think it was August that the Japanese surrendered right after the atomic bomb.
Okay.
So the war was over. I knew that I wouldn't have to go to the Far East.
Right.
But I was still in the Army. And I was called an Army of the United States, AUS. That's because I graduated from Officer Candidate School. There are 3 categories, sort of National Guard, Reserve, and a regular Army. The regular Army would be officers who were graduated from West Point or were from ROTC, and they got that kind of commission.
We're going to have 15 more minutes.
Okay, well, okay. I came home, I met my wife. She hadn't seen me for 2.5 years, and it was a great reunion. I continued to be a reserve officer, but I was not in uniform, okay? And we established our home in Akron, Ohio. I went back to school, back to the University of Akron, because I didn't have my baccalaureate degree. And we had a baby. We had a little girl, Deborah, and she was born in November of '46. So now time has passed by, and by this time I'm convinced that I want to go to the school in Washington, D.C.
I want to ask you, when 2 questions, and the one is, do you remember the day in Europe when the war in Europe was
Over?
Over?
Oh, yes.
What day was that for you?
May the 2nd, 1945.
And how did that information come to you?
We got it through radio, by teletype, by word of mouth. The German army has surrendered. The war is over.
And I imagine that was pretty exhilarating.
Oh, you can't imagine, Archer, what everybody realized at that point in time. Oh boy, I've made it. I got through this thing without being killed. And I don't know. I know that you fire your weapons in the air out of exuberance. And everybody. For the first time, you can stand up in your foxhole and not be afraid that somebody's going to take a bead on your head, you know. It's over.
Right. When it was finally over, were you all anywhere around Germans, or
Oh, yeah.
what were their reactions?
Their reaction was about the same as ours.
What about military Germans?
Well, those soldiers that you are opposed to, they know that the game is up.
And what did they do?
They just held up their hands, they threw down their weapons, they threw down their pistols, and it's all over. It's all over. They were just as happy to be in the condition that there's no more shooting going on.
Right.
So everybody was rather thrilled. I don't suppose there's any such thing as being thrilled about being a prisoner of war, but the war is over. That's the important thing for them.
Right. The next question I wanted to ask was, when you came back and you got back home, what impact or what happened to you as a person personally as a result of being in combat, being in war, being afraid for a long time, being in uncertain areas?
That's a very good point, because it's very appropriate you ask it right now. We've got soldiers coming back from Iraq who are stressed out. And there's no such thing as being comfortable with being in combat. It's something that you have to put out of your mind after you come back. It's easier said than done. It's easier said than done.
What about for you?
Well, I found that my military service was honorable, as was a great many other soldiers. I was glad that the war was over, that I wouldn't have to go to Japan, or the Far East, as we called it. And that I could get back to civilian life and continue my education. That's what I wanted to do.
Did you share experiences with your wife about what happened over?
Very little, very little.
Did she ask you any questions?
Yeah, oh yeah, but you just don't describe it in detail. I remember one thing that happened just after I came back to Akron. This must have been now early, let's say January of 1946. The war in both theaters, Europe and Far East, was over. A very dear buddy of mine who I'd gone to school with came back from the Far East. And he and I went to a bar one night. I'll remember that very vividly. And this was probably, we were civilians now, not in uniform. And we were describing war stories, which you could do between soldiers, you know. And sitting at the bar up the line was a guy who was partially inebriated, and it turned out that he was an ex-Marine and had fought many battles in the Far East. I mean, gruesome battles. And he heard us talking about this, and my buddy who had been in the Far East described it, and he made some comment. I can't tell what it was, for example, but words to the effect, what you guys in the Army really don't know what war is all about. The Marines are the real fighters. And that took Johnny Palmer, that was his name. He didn't like that a bit, and I didn't like it. And we were just about ready to come to blows. And the bartender stopped us, and he says, look, you're all former soldiers and Marines. You did a good job. Now let's cut out the crap and shake hands and leave the bar. And we did. So that's what it amounted to. After the war and I went to school, I wanted to continue at a school called Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I had decided that what I wanted to do was to go into the foreign service in the American government, in the diplomatic corps. And the only way you could do that is to go to Georgetown or other schools. So my wife and I, we had a little baby girl by this time. We went to Washington, we moved there, and I started to school at Georgetown. And while in probably the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of schooling, I ran into an officer friend of mine who I had fought with in World War II. He was on duty at the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. And he talked to me about trying to become a regular Army officer. He said, you can become a regular Army officer if you want to make the military your career. And I talked it over with my wife, Grace, and just before we decided, we had another little boy, a boy this time, and he was born at Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C. So I said, well, that's a good idea. I never thought about being a regular Army officer, but I don't have my degree yet. I want to get a degree in something. And they finally assigned me the Army to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to begin what is called a competitive tour for 1 year. You're an officer. I was a first lieutenant at this time, and in the reserves, I was a captain. But when I went on active duty again to Fort Knox, I was a first lieutenant. I became a company commander, training recruits there. And it was at Fort Knox in November of 1949 by this time. I got shot in the range. The bullet went, it was an accident. The bullet went in my neck here and stopped right here. And I was laid up for about 4 months in what is called Crutchfield tongue traction. You're flat on your back. You can't move. They're afraid that if you move your head, you're going to paralyze yourself. So they lie you in the bed, flatten your back, and they shave your head, and they put 2 holes in your skull, drill down about that far, and they put a little set of ice tongs. That's what it looks like. They're called Crutchfield tongs. And tied to that is a rope. It goes out over a pulley over your bed, and it hangs down, and at the end of the rope is a bag of sand, which keeps you absolutely immobile for a long period of time.
Did you recover from that?
Oh yes, I recovered pretty good. The only after effects I've had is, you know how your hands and arms feel when they're tingling when they're asleep? My hands and arms have never stopped. That sensation, I have good use. I couldn't for about 4 months do anything. But slowly but surely the movement came back. And I remember the doctor telling me, when you can do this little exercise with both hands, touch all your fingertips with your thumb, we'll let you go and give you what is called convalescent leave. I could do it, but I could never get these two fingers together until one day I could move my arm by this time. I reached up and did like that, and now they're together. And I let out a yell, and the nurse came running. I said, "Look, I've got them together." And she called the doctor in, and he says, "Well, open them up. Now close them." And hell, I couldn't close them to save my life. So that's what happened.
Well, first of all, I wanted to conclude a little bit.
Okay.
And I wanted to say, just from a person my age, that I find it, we very much appreciate what you did in World War II.
Thank
your
you.
service. It has more than impacted my life for what you and your fellow soldiers did for us.
Oh, no question about it.
It's very, very important to me and other people, and it's been an honor interviewing you.
Thank you.
And thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome.
And thanks again. Is there anything else you'd like to
Well, from the time that I got a regular Army, and this was now 1948, 2 years later I found myself in combat again in Korea. The war broke out there in June of 1950, and I stayed in Korea in combat from August of 1950 when I got over there until October 1951 in combat. I again was fortunate I didn't get shot in combat, and all I can say about Korea is it was absolute hell. It's there's no way to compare warfare and warfare. You just can't do it. But I have always resolved that I never got warm in Korea. I couldn't get warm, and I was not alone. Every soldier, every Marine and Navy type was the same thing. Anyhow, I stayed there, and when I finally reached enough points to be rotated back home, I asked to be reassigned to Japan. And with the understanding that I could bring my family, who was a little baby girl and boy, to Japan. They agreed. I went to Japan. I served there as a captain now for about a year and a half. My family joined me in Japan. And then we came back home, and for the next 25 years, about 28 years, I was in the service, and I got promoted all the way up.
very much?
Thank you, Archer.